Thank you for joining this interactive session on multilateralism, opportunities and challenges. As you've already heard, my name is Johannes Lin, and really it's my great pleasure to reinvent myself this morning from chair of the replenishment to moderator of what should be a really highly interactive and, to me personally, exciting session. All of us, you, the governors, your countries, all of us who are in this room, in one way or another, are embedded in, participate in, and, as some might say, occasionally confronted by multilateral action and multilateral institutions. I myself, I've been in this business of multilateralism for much of my life. I worked for 30 years at the World Bank. Since then, I've worked with a lot of international organizations, the UN, the multilateral development banks, international NGOs. I've served as chair for IFAD replenishments. And I recently published a paper actually on the topic of current threats to multilateralism. And the key theme of that paper was that I see a range of geopolitical, national political, and institutional factors, which I think together contribute to forming a significant threat to the multilateral approach and the multilateral institutions that we collectively have created since the Second World War, and that I believe have contributed significantly, even though they're not perfect by any means. But these institutions, these interventions, these actions have contributed significantly to global peace and global prosperity. I have to say, though, if I was a bit depressed when writing this paper, I was much more optimistic as a result of the replenishment consultation, which we just concluded, because I do see in this occasion of getting together of so many countries, that the spirit of multilateralism is still very much alive and is still very much here, in this case in particular, to support IFAD as a multilateral international institution. I only mention this about my own perspective because I want to share with you my excitement of being here today in this position and to moderate, to listen to our very exciting panel, but also then to turn it over to you and listen to your concerns, your issues, and your contributions to this important topic. Now, let me turn to our really distinguished colleagues who've agreed to join us here this morning. By the way, I've been told we can go a little bit over the 1 o'clock timeline, so we do have a bit more time than maybe you might think, since it's already 12 o'clock now. So let me introduce our panelists. First, to my right, Ambassador Marta Bárcena Coqui, who currently serves as permanent representative of her country, Mexico, to the Rome-based UN agencies. And she has a very distinguished career already before coming to Rome in the Mexican Foreign Service, and served as ambassador of Mexico to Denmark, as well as to Turkey, with also responsibility for Georgia and Central Asia. And she has actually published articles on international security, on peacekeeping operations and intercultural communication. I think this will help you, especially here, so I look forward to helping us with intercultural communication, Marta. I also am delighted to have with us Dr. Ibrahim Assane Mayaki, who is the chief, right next to Marta, who is the chief executive officer of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, which you all know as NEPAD, and he has served with great distinction as the former Prime Minister of Niger, 1997 to 2000. He has created a think tank focusing on health and education policy, and he served with great distinction in the UN system in various capacities, including with the lead group of scaling up nutrition, the Sun Movement, and also served as an advisor to the ECOSOC Council in the UN. And he received many decorations from numerous countries for his dedicated service to agriculture in the area of agriculture. Third, to his right, Dr. David Nabarro, who is the founder and director of a social enterprise, 4SD Skills Systems Synergies for Sustainable Development.
Yeah.
The 4 S's, great. He's a medical doctor and an expert in health and nutrition, and he's had many high-level positions in the British government, World Health Organization, and in the United Nations. He's been very active in the fight against HIV/AIDS, also against cholera in Haiti, and against Ebola in Western Africa. And he coordinated also the scaling up nutrition, the Sun movement, and served as special advisor to Secretary General on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Climate Change. His enterprise, social enterprise, which he now leads, is supporting leadership for sustainable development, and particular relevant here, focus on food, land use, and climate change. And finally, it's my special pleasure also to introduce to you Dr. Alvaro Ilario, who is the newly established Chief Financial Officer and Associate Vice President of the Financial Operations Department at IFAD. And in that position, he's responsible for the design and implementation of the financial strategies and the financial policies at IFAD. Before he joined IFAD, he was in senior positions at the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, in the World Bank Group. And he also has a background in business, economics, and finance in the private sector, and indeed also has taught in academic institutions. So with this, I think I can honestly say we have a fantastic panel. Let me briefly outline for you the structure of today's session. I'll give you a very brief introduction on some of the key issues and questions that we might focus on today to sort of help us frame what we're dealing with. I will then turn to the panelists, and we'll sit down actually. We have a conversation where I will ask them a few questions. They'll respond, interact as we see how it goes. Probably about 20, 25 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time for interaction with all of you. Now, there's one innovation which I just want to flag, and it's a bit of an experiment for IFAD. We have these devices, each of us, most of you at least should have them in front of you. I'll explain to you how we use them, because they will give you an opportunity, all of you who have a device, to actually share with us up here and with each other how you view particular issues and questions that we'll put to you as we proceed. So I'll come back to you to explain exactly how that works in a minute. So let me, by way of introduction, start by teeing up a few questions for you all, for us all, which I think will help to frame the exchange on multilateralism, opportunities, and challenges. So the first question might be, what do we mean by multilateralism? Now, I don't propose that we discuss that question, because it really could lead us, I don't think, very, very far forward on the substance. Let me suggest a definition, and namely that we focus on initiatives and institutions that involve multiple countries and address economic, social, and/or environmental issues on a global or at least regional scale. So let's maybe agree that this is a reasonable definition for now, and move on to what I think are the more actually important and helpful and useful questions. The most basic one, which we in a sense started discussing earlier this morning already with this discussion of IFAD replenishment, is, do we really need multilateral actions and institutions to address global and regional issues? Now, I don't think that's an empty question, not a trick question, because in fact, there are a lot of people out there who think multilateralism really isn't all that helpful, and who would like to move away from it. And I come now from America, the US of A, and unfortunately, I have to say, this is a thought, an idea that is a bit too prevalent for my liking today in the United States. So this is the first really important substantial question. Do we really need multilateralism? But second question, since we're in IFAD, the next question is, what multilateral actions and institutions are specifically needed in the areas of agriculture, rural development, food security, and nutrition? That's a very general question. Let me break it down a bit. into subsidiary questions. So let's ask this. Are the current multilateral structures and approaches broadly appropriate and operating effectively, or is there a need for fundamental change in the agriculture, et cetera, area? Are the multilateral agencies that are active in this area cooperating effectively with a wide range of potential partners in the public, private, non-governmental sectors and with each other? And the third subsidiary question is specifically for IFAD, is IFAD fit for purpose as a key multilateral institution in the area of agriculture, et cetera? So this is, in a sense, the first important question, I think, for agriculture and rural development and multilateralism. And finally, let me turn to another big question, which is, in the area of agriculture, rural development, food security, nutrition, are multilateral interventions and institutions appropriately resourced? In other words, are the aggregate amounts of finance sufficient to address the global challenges in this area and specifically the relevant SDGs? Is the financing appropriately leveraged? Is there an appropriate balance between access to grants, sovereign loans, and market-based finance? And finally, for IFAD, is IFAD heading in the right direction as it seeks to diversify and leverage its sources of funding? So, I hope I haven't carried on too long, but I thought maybe asking those questions can help us, even though you may have different ones, and please feel encouraged to raise them as we go along. These are the kind of questions I think could be usefully addressed. Now, with this by way of introduction, let's go to the next step and test our technology. This is to sort of warm us up and wake us up a bit. Each of your delegations has one of these devices. Actually, you should have more than, there should be a total of about 220 in this room. I wonder whether our guests got some too. You don't? Ah, well, maybe we have some spare ones somewhere. If not, I'm sorry, I apologize. But you'll be able to see what everybody else in the room thinks. So let's see how we go. So these devices will allow you to register your views, your feelings, if you wish, on specific issues and questions that I will put to you on a scale of 1 to 9, where 9 represents the most intensive positive sentiment, and 1 the weakest or the most negative, depending a bit on the question. There's on your desks, there should be instruction cards. The key issue is that if the little green light here blinks slowly, then you know that your device is on. If there's no light at all, no blinking, nothing, you need to press the red button or the button that says on here. Press it, wait a few seconds, and then the green blinking light should come on. Now, when I put to you a question, then the devices are turned to active, meaning the green light will turn from blinking to steady, and then, in fact, the device is ready for use, meaning you can then press, preferably only once, but press firmly. You can press any of the buttons 1 to 9, representing your assessment of the statement or question that is being put to you. After you've done that, the red line should light up. Then your vote has been taken, and you can only reactivate it after you can only vote again for the next subsequent question. The votes are then tallied and are shown up here as bars and in percentages, and will give us an instant feedback on how you think about the issues that are being put to you. Now, as I said, this is a bit of an experiment. I've never done this in as big a hall in this. I've done it in smaller groups, and I just hope the technology works. If not, we'll abort the experiment and move on. But let's see. Let's do a test run. And so there should be a question showing up shortly. Where's the technology? We need the first question. Let me read you see? So the question is, we need, and you can tell I'm a bit biased in the way I put this, but this is a test question. We need more multilateral engagement than we have now to address pressing global social and environmental issues. If you feel much more multilateral global action is needed, press 9. If you feel forget it, if anything, we need less, press 1. If you feel we're about where we should be, you might think about pressing 5 in the middle. So that is the question. Take a look at your device. If it's blinking, actually, it now should be solid green. If you all have a solid green, you're ready to go. Press now. You have 20 seconds to make your choice. Press now, and let's see where you come out. We already have 41 votes, 52 votes. Remember, there are about 200 in the room, so we might still go a bit further. 90. It's almost like the Olympics here. 91. Let's see whether we can make it to 100. Okay. All right, I'll give you 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stop. Okay. So with 106 votes, that's not bad for the first effort. Let's see whether we can improve going ahead. Let's see when the tally, there we are. Tally is, I take it these numbers are the percentages, so not quite 50% of you think that much more multilateral engagement is needed to address pressing global economic and social issues. I'm interested to see that there are some of you who feel, indeed, 6% almost. If you add, actually, sort of going down the first 3, it's almost 10% who feel maybe we got too much. I think that's interesting. Anyway, that's that first test question. All right, second test question, then we go, and I apologize for the delay, you've been very patient. For those of you who were party to the replenishment consultations, you may recall that just about every meeting I introduced with a statement that was a bit tendentious perhaps, or pretentious, but I said, in my view, IFAD is a jewel among international development finance institutions. So I'd like to test out my own presumptive statement here against the views that you have in this room, and you will see that your device is activated, so please go ahead and press whatever you feel. Let me maybe just qualify 9, of course, for strong support my statement, 1 strong disagreement, and 5 if you're sort of wishy-washy about it. So let's give it a few seconds here and see whether we come to a total of more than 100 this time. All right, well, almost there. So it looks like we have about 100 active participants in this room.
Yeah, we can.
99. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. We're back at 104. I think that was the same numbers last time, wasn't it? Well, that's great. Okay, so how are we doing? Quite a few wishy-washy ones in there. 16% basically think, well, I'm not so sure. Some of you feel, IFAD really could do a hell of a lot better. That's good to know. But still, there are probably about altogether over 50% of you who think IFAD is a bit of a gem. That's good news. Thank you. Okay, so that was in a way to get us warmed up, because now it's getting actually serious. Sorry, I have an urgent message here. Okay. Thank you. So, the urgent message is that Dr. Miyake, whom is with us here, has to leave and be for a meeting at 1 o'clock, I believe. So we'll have to make sure we have you completed by your views fully incorporated by then.
Okay.
Now, let me turn then to our panelists. And once again, thank you for joining us today. As I indicated, I will sort of start the discussion with a question to each of you. And let me start with the ambassador. And so, Ambassador, from your perspective as a Mexican, but maybe also as Latin American, what role and challenges and opportunities do you actually see for multilateral action and institutions, especially in the agriculture rural development area? Can you maybe share sort of what you see as the principal challenges, opportunities from your perspective?
Claro que sí, Johannes, y
Yes, of course, Janis. Yes, of course. Now, if we revise the 2030 agenda, that was obviously multilaterally negotiated, that agenda, and we look at all of the 17 SDGs and the 230 indicators, we'll see that a very large number of the goals, the indicators, are actually specifically linked to the 3 Rome-based agencies. And sometimes we think that the only important goals for the Rome-based agencies are 1, eliminating poverty, rural poverty in particular, and eradicating hunger, and SDG 2. But in actual fact, there are an awful lot more goals in which the RBAs could play a major role. 5 on gender equality, working with rural women, indigenous rural women, and also the equality goal, which is crucial. If we don't get rid of the inequalities which exist out there, we're not going to be able to achieve that goal, and we're not going to make headway. Also, the question of climate change, adaptation, mitigation, protection of biodiversity, which is essential to rural developments and agricultural success. Basically, what I would say is that I think we need to be very aware within the whole UN system, including in New York, about the fact that the role of the 3 RBAs, yes, it's largely focused on Agenda 2030, but not only on the development goals as a whole, but on a whole set of aims. So it's here in Rome, if the 3 agencies work in coordinated fashion within the framework of the recent reform of the UN Secretariat General, it's within that we will achieve progress on goals 1 and 2, but we'll also be able to move forward on Agenda 2030 as a whole.
To make sure that the Rome-based agencies are squarely focused, not just on the 2 principal areas that would normally be associated with them, but also on the broader agenda of the SDGs, and that indeed this be recognized more explicitly. Let me quickly follow up, though, with a question, and that is, so specific for IFAD, what do you think among the Rome-based agencies, how can IFAD contribute to that particular goal of yours?
bueno, yo soy de los que piensan.
Well, I'm one of those people who believes that IFAD is a real jewel of an institution because it's very well focused. And once it's intervened in emergency, the World Food Programme has intervened in emergencies. FAO and IFAD can then step in at the second stage. And the major role of IFAD could be there in order to provide the sustainability for measures which are adopted for emergency situations, greater urgency. And the way in which IFAD works together with the countries, I think, consolidates the national institutional capacity. And that's role of IFAD, in other words, working together with national governments in order to achieve Agenda 2030, working in the medium and long term as well. It is that which I think characterizes the work of IFAD in bringing about this transition and rural development, which is so crucial.
IFAD has a particular role in sort of strengthening local capacity, in addition, of course, to delivering its services and finance to the poorest rural areas. Thank you very much. I appreciate that contribution. And it's now my pleasure to turn to Dr. Miyake. Now, as the CEO of NIPAD, which is, after all, a multilateral institution, and deals with a lot with other multilateral institutions in pursuing your goals, what lessons, now from perhaps an African perspective, given the focus of NIPAD on Africa, what lessons do you take away on what are the most sort of important opportunities and challenges in getting effective multilateral action for African agriculture and rural development?
Well, I would start by making a quick historical contextualization. We implement today in the continent a global strategic framework for agricultural transformation, which is named CAADP, the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program. And it's implemented in 52 African countries, which have come with national agricultural investment plans. But the history of CAADP dates back to 2003 in Maputo, where African leaders decided to prioritize agriculture. And there were two institutions within the UN system which really supported the design of that framework. And the two institutions were FAO and IFAD, against the thinking of many other institutions. So we could say that the design at the origin of CAADP was within a space where multilateralism was active, because FAO and IFAD helped create it, but other institutions were not really on board. And FAO and IFAD did speed up the process in order to have this framework integrated by the other institutions. So much afterwards, the World Bank came on board, and then CAADP became the framework. So we can say, from the NEPAD perspective and the African Union perspective, that CAADP was a product of multilateralism, and that product was aligned to Africa's priorities, because remember, 2003, agriculture was not considered a priority by many institutions. So IFAD and FAO helped do it. Point number two, regarding the opportunities, I think that the main opportunity that we have today is the SDGs framework. Because it helps congregate thinking, knowledge, practices, goals, indicators, where everybody can rally, and the universal dimension helps that. But at the same time, we are faced with a relative perception on how globalization is working. So we have the SDGs propelled by the UN, where all of us embarked in. And in parallel, you have a questioning of globalization. So I think that issue will become extremely important in order to make that opportunity a reality. Right. So how we deal with globalization in the implementation of the SDGs will be extremely critical. Challenges, I see fundamentally two challenges within the multilateral system. The first one is integration. We know that agriculture, by definition, goes beyond agriculture. It is multi-sectoral. And I was extremely pleased yesterday when I heard the president of IFAD refer to the fact that strategically they want to embrace that multi-sectorality by bringing in issues of climate change, land, etc. So I think it's the way to go. But at the same time, it's a challenge because our institutions nationally are not sufficiently adapted to multi-sectoralism, and the multilateral system itself is not always adapted to multi-sectorality. So that will be a challenge, but it is important to examine that challenge, integrate it. And I think in the case of IFAD, which has built an important knowledge regarding rural development, remember, 70% of Africans live in rural areas. By focusing on rural development, you focus on a huge priority for the continent.
Thank you very much. That actually lines very much nicely up with the ambassador's comment, who felt that we really needed to go beyond the two particular SDGs and look at a broader, and I put words in your mouth, Madam Ambassador, in a multi-sectoral and broader perspective. So thank you very much. And I also think you already focused a bit on sort of how IFAD needs to pick up on this, and congratulated the President for actually pushing in this direction with his thematic and other initiatives. Then let me turn to Dr. Nabarro. So, Dr. Nabarro, you've had all this rich experience in different capacities in international multilateral organizations, and now you run a social enterprise that's active in the area of health, food security, and so on. So what do you think multilateral interventions and institutions need to do to solve, address at least, if not fully solve, but let's hope solve, the world's food security challenges?
Thanks very much indeed for the chance to be here. And it's great actually to be back in Rome and meeting many people with whom I've worked over the years. And now I'm going to tell you that I think the challenge you face for the future is enormous, and I hope that you will all be feeling quite frustrated that there is still so much to be done. And please, please don't ever be comfortable with the notion that IFAD is a jewel. It's still got a lot more to do, and more ambition is needed. I'll tell you why. If we start with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it's the only plan that exists for the future of our world and her people. If we don't take that plan seriously, we're letting down future generations. Our children, and their children will not be served unless we're looking ahead to the future. And let's just look at our food and land use systems in the world today. They're not working. They don't produce food that is nutritious and healthy. We have an obesity epidemic, which is not only killing people now, it's going to get worse. And with that will come diabetes, high blood pressure, increasing in the number of people they affect. We have food systems that are emptying aquifers, reducing biodiversity, leading to the reduction in forest cover. Basically, they are damaging ecosystems everywhere. We have food systems that in 15 years' time will probably be the major producer of carbon in our atmosphere, because energy will be transformed, and I expect to see a lot of transportation changed. And lastly, we have food systems that do not actually contribute to enough prosperity in rural areas. Otherwise, there would not be mass migration from rural areas to urban areas because young people can't find work. Food systems are failing in these 4 dimensions, and they've got to be got right. And that's where IFAD is so important, because it's a financing institution, because it works at local level, because it's science-based, and because it's efficient. It needs to be empowered to do more. Multilateralism is great for solving world problems, but it can only work if it's adequately financed, adequately supported, and if it works in an integrated way. So I shall be a massive advocate for IFAD continuing to grow and be strong, but it has to be more ambitious because the food system challenges are enormous at this time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nabarro, and I think you already pointed very strongly to what IFAD needs to do, so I won't follow up with a question on that, as I might have. But clearly, so like our other...
But I was hoping you'd ask me one.
Okay, then please go ahead.
Because there is one other thing that I've learned.
What does IFAD need to do?
Over the years. and it's a little bit, it's not just about what IFAD needs to do. What's the whole multilateral system is learning to do, but needs to do it quicker. And it's this. So much of our multilateral work is based around governments and the role of governments, local government and central government. But all of us know that in real life, it's a combination of what government does, what business does, and by the way, all farmers, as you know, are business people, what science and research gives us, and also what civil society, faith groups, and others have to offer. It's very much a multi-stakeholder approach that is the way of the future. And so I just encourage IFAD to do more and more and more of encouraging multi-stakeholder action for the transformation of food systems. And by the way, I'd love to see IFAD change its name to IFAST, the International Fund for Agriculture and Food Systems Transformation. It doesn't quite work, but you know what I mean. Because I actually think that food systems transformation, as Ibrahim Mayaki just said, is the key challenge of the future.
Thank you. So focus on food systems as sort of a key element, and really...
Well, then that helps you with all the nutrition stuff.
Exactly.
You know, we heard in the video about malnutrition. Unless we get the nutrition right, then what's the point of having food systems?
And actually, in the 6-7 years that I've now been working on IFAD replenishments, it's very interesting to note that the nutrition angle has moved from marginal to central. So I think you should be pleased in that regard. So let me turn then to Dr. Ilario. So you came to Rome recently from IFC, relatively big financial organization, development organization compared to IFAD. And you're now the Associate Vice President for Finance. So what lessons do you think you can bring to IFAD, but maybe more generally to that sort of multilateral engagement in agricultural development, nutrition, food systems, and so on? How best to raise and leverage, important leverage, I think, is a sort of a new idea now in this area, the financial resources that the institutions have. So what in that financial area, resources, Dr. Nabarro mentioned resources. What can we do to actually make the resource go further, but maybe also to get a few more resources into the system? Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes. Thank you for the invitation and for being able to present what our view is as for the future in terms of finance and what might be coming. I think David already talked about the ambition, and that's exactly what President Hombo is talking about, and we are totally aligned in viewing how we can get to a bigger impact, not only in what we are doing currently, but also in getting a greater volume, because we know that the demand is there in terms of youth unemployment, in terms of food security, in terms of nutrition. So the demand is there, so how to get there? In order to put it a little bit into a context, usually this is more of a UN world and a UN system, but there's also another world outside, which is the developmental finance world. It's composed by MDBs, regional banks, agencies, and multilateral financial institutions like ourselves. So that world has changed dramatically. There have been recently trends that have totally changed the way that these institutions finance themselves and how they channel the funds. And in that way, my belief is that IFAD has to change too, and it needs to adapt and to take into account the changing landscape and the changing environment. You today, as members, already mentioned some of the difficulties that you're going through in terms of, well, an increasing public debt, increasing public deficits, less possibilities of contributing through core replenishments to the actual financing of IFAD. Since 2007, in the great financial crisis, we have seen the leverage of the private balance sheet, but an increase in the leverage and the debt of the public balance sheet. We have also seen a change in the political administration. We have seen some changes in priorities that are also affecting your decisions, but more focused into what has happened in the development world and what IFAD is also trying to focus. We have seen a need for more of an approach to private financing more than public financing. You're asking us to focus on co-financing, and that's going to be one of the keys for us going forward. Also, on a value for money, I think it has been recognized that IFAD is one of the best institutions instead of value for money, but that's not enough. I feel that's not good enough. We are also being asked, and the general development financial world is being asked to focus in terms of themes, in terms of gender, climate, youth, and we are also addressing that type of concerns. I envision a future in which all these different type of financial institutions become specialized in themes, and I think that's an opportunity for IFAD, and I think we are very well placed for that type of opportunity. Another thing that is happening outside is that there has been a race to the bottom in terms of lending terms. A lot of institutions are talking about not enough pipeline, not enough good bankable projects. At IFAD, we have that. We are setting up a structure, a SIF structure, in order to get these funds and with private co-financing. And I think the bankable projects are at IFAD, so that's also an opportunity for IFAD. So my main message is, it's not enough for us to have good value for money. I think we have to engage more with you as members. We have to listen to you better, but also we have to listen to the borrowers. And that's where also finance comes in. It's not only expanding our borrowing strategies, it's also listening to, do countries need more flexibility in terms of currency, in terms of lending terms, in terms of the type of product, in terms of the type of project? We need to listen more. And we are trying to adapt and to be able financially to match that sides, the asset side of the balance sheet and the liability side, to really give what the borrower's demand is. And the end message is that we need to make it bigger, with a bigger impact in what we're doing currently, and also in expanding into our borrowing strategies, which I might come later, but yeah, I'd like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think with having started the discussion, and I thank our panelists for giving us a lot of, I think, interesting ideas here, and to some extent challenging ideas, especially for the Rome-based agencies, if I may say so. I will throw it open in a minute, but before I do, let's maybe go back to our device and pick up on one issue that I sort of has a common theme, have heard through the panelists' presentation or comments in response to my questions to them. And this is the question, it's a somewhat generic or general question, but let's take a sense of how you feel about this in this room. That in the area of agriculture, rural development, food security, nutrition, multilateral agencies need to cooperate much more effectively, and I would add listen effectively, to a wide range of potential partners in the public, but especially in the private and non-governmental sectors and with each other. Can we put that question up just so that everybody sees it? This would be, yes, this is the one. Slightly amended to add the point about listening. So basically it says these multilateral agencies, and it's not specifically only focused on IFAD right now, but more generally, really have to be not only working on their own with sort of limited partners at a given time, but we really have to be much more open. And I would add especially to the non-governmental, non-public sector agencies, but those are also included. And I've sort of thrown in the end with each other. It's kind of a mindset question. Do these agencies have the right mindset to work in broad, multifaceted partnerships? So with this as a question, let's take the vote. The green button is on, so tell me how you feel about it. 9 would be that, yes, I strongly feel that they need to do more. Let's have 1 being basically where we should be right now, because I don't think anybody would want to do less of this. But so let me bias this perhaps a bit. 1 is we're doing okay just now in terms of outreach partnership. 9 would be we really, really need more. So we have 81. Maybe we lost a few. Okay, almost there. Let me count down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. Okay, 102. We lost 2. I'm sorry. Okay, so strong sentiment that really we, the international organizations, really have to do better in this area. Let me just say, as somebody who's been in this business, of course, on the multilateral side, it ain't easy necessarily. So and it costs in some ways. So it's a challenge. It really is a challenge, but it's a challenge, I think, certainly listening to you, that the international organizations need to take on. With this, let me turn the discussion over to you and ask who of you would like to, I see Germany. Let me just sort of take a stock over there. Is that India? Okay, so, and then France. All right, let's start with those three and see where it takes us. Germany, please.
Yeah, it's Burkina Faso.
Burkina Faso would be 4. Let me make a note of this so I don't forget. Germany, India, France, Burkina Faso. Great, thank you.
Nigeria.
Germany, please.
Which one? Nigeria.
Yeah, I should say you'll be given, the microphones won't work for the session, so you'll be given microphones. So just keep waving until you have your microphone. Thank you. Germany, please.
Yes, thank you very much. And also coming a bit back to your introductory remarks, I think there are 3 prejudices against the multilateral system that we happen to meet very often. First is, it is expensive. They keep asking for more money. Well, we've set with the Agenda 2030 the most ambitious set of targets development cooperation has ever set. So it is obvious that this will cost money. And I think it's great, and coming to that last question here, that we try to tap into the capital market, that we try to mobilize more private funding. But I would also caution you all, private funding is always looking for business cases. So there are certainly many things where you can create win-win situations, but certainly not for everything. So my feeling is the development cooperation community is just looking into how to do more on the private side. We shouldn't do too much of that. We also should do the rest. Second prejudice is the multilateral system is inefficient. And yes, we have built in quite a few bureaucratic mechanisms to avoid that somebody working in a multilateral organization coming from country A makes use of his position to channel money into country A. And yes, there is not always sufficient cooperation between multilateral agencies. I'm very happy that the UN reform is tackling these 2 things and it's trying to make the United Nations, especially the United Nations organizations, more quicker, more performant, and also more cooperative. And I think IFAD should become a vital part of that. Third point is, there's a dogmatic view that whenever I'm working bilateral, it's my decision, it's my purpose, it's my visibility, while when I'm working multilaterally, it serves the multilateral agency in itself, the interest of a multilateral agenda. It doesn't really have to do anything with me. And that's wrong. We need a global governance for the global public goods. It's our international, global, but also our national interest to have that in place. So the multilateral agenda and the multilateral institutions also serve our national purposes. And I think it's brilliant that IFAD is trying to do more co-financing with bilaterals, where each and both parties can keep their visibility as well. So I think with this regard, IFAD is on a good path and should continue the reforms, should continue to tackle the challenges, and then it will become a brilliant example of how the multilateral system should work and can be very attractive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To break the ice, one thing I hadn't mentioned, unfortunately, that let's keep perhaps our interventions to about 3 minutes. I think our German colleague just did so, so let's follow that example. Let me turn to India. India, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, the panelists. Multilateralism essentially is the cooperation of governments at multiple levels to solve the global problems and for each other. And this had its heyday. It had a very big presence and did a lot of things for the world. Over the last couple of years, in fact some decades, we have seen globalization taking over, where citizens, businesses, technologies, and many other actors cooperate and achieve these what multilateral agencies used to do earlier at that level. And that is expanding enormously. In fact, multilaterals promoted globalization first. Now it seems that globalization is actually becoming a bigger force than the multilateral. So my question is that in this scenario where we have these globalization forces becoming much, much bigger, bigger, should we not reinvent, should we not think about multilateralism to be better focused on global goods, solving SDGs kind of issues, and get out of many other areas where perhaps they were there earlier? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good question, which I'll come back to our panel maybe after a few more comments from the floor, because I think this is something that they could perhaps help us with. How would we actually better be focused in future to respond in a context where other global actors have become increasingly important? And I might add, by the way, that of course also the whole idea of globalization is running into some flack now, and so that context is a different one, a shifting one for the multilateral actors that many of us believe are important, but they need to deal with those questions. I next have France, followed by Burkina Faso and Nigeria. France, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for this very interesting session. I think when we speak of multilateralism and we look at the challenges, we can certainly understand the need for this. First of all, the challenges no longer have any borders, whether you're talking about climate or an interdependent economy. All these phenomena have regional causes and require regional, if not global, solutions. Then if you look at the advantages of Agenda 2030 is to show the interaction between all the stakes that have been identified and that are all part of the nexus from peace to security to development. Now, as Mr. Nabarro pointed out very well, this requires a multi-actor approach. It's not just governments, and multilateralism has to be broadened to include all the actors, including the private sector, that's important, civil society. So all the actors and stakeholders must help to solve the problems. And we also need expertise, because in a growingly complex world, no one can find or have the proper expertise alone. You must work with others. This is why France feels very strongly that the response to large international challenges is through this multilateral approach. And we certainly welcome IFAD's position and the ambitious replenishment that we have adopted. And France is very proud of having made its contribution through a strong increase from 46 to 59% million, including, of course, our concessional loans. Of course, there are many challenges, and we have touched on a few. There's a question of efficiency, certainly. And here, IFAD's OPEX initiative is particularly important, and we welcome it, and the challenge of coordination. We need greater coordination with the Rome-based agencies, which is the very spirit of the UN reform as we see it. And then another challenge that I'd like to hear our speakers mention is the link between multilateralism, the global level, and the local level. How can we ensure that there's an ownership on the part of the actors and decision makers at all these levels? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I think these are also very good questions. Let me move on to Burkina Faso. I then have Nigeria and UK, and then maybe I'll go back to our panelists, because we, I think, want to have this interactive discussion. So with this, Burkina Faso, please.
Je vous remercie de me donner la...
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. It's true, it's no longer necessary to show that multilateralism is extraordinarily useful. And I think one of the main reasons that it is because it can mobilize the whole international community around a universal challenge, which makes it possible to create greater awareness, each state and its peoples, to recognize the common challenges that we must face for the future of humanity. And this was the case, for example, when we adopted the Sustainable Development Goals and this is an area where I think multilateralism has helped to contribute a great deal regarding women. The whole Beijing process, for example, has ensured that women have a voice. And where in the past they were invisible or their voice was not heard, people have felt they have to progress in this area. And I think multilateralism makes it possible to create norms so that each state can be aware of how far it has gone in the struggle against certain problems, for example, and what progress has been made. Now, I think the greatest challenge, and President Bo mentioned it this morning, we cannot think that the multilateral agencies can do the job for them. There is no multilateral partner, no matter how multilateral they are, that can replace the involvement and action of a government in a development sector. In my own experience, I have worked for some years within the UN, and I realized that one of the greatest limitations is that when governments become dependent on multilateral institutions to develop their own states, and I would like to take as an example of this, when the Sustainable Development Goals, many governments amongst the poor countries were saying, oh, we didn't have enough resources, we weren't supported sufficiently, etc. The Millennium Development Goals, I beg your pardon. And then as regards IFAD, as well as other institutions who finance and support projects, it's important that this be borne in mind. And here I am supporting the idea of the ambassador as France. When these are local projects, it's very difficult for them to influence real change within a country if it isn't integrated into national policies. Therefore, there has to be an interaction. We have to make sure that if a project is able to solve a local problem, then that means that the national policy in this agricultural sector, or whatever sector it may be, needs to integrate those strategies of that project, if it has succeeded, into their own national strategy. We cannot expect there to be integral development if we are resting only on individual projects. This won't provoke a change at the national level. And I'm very happy to have had this possibility of discussing this with the evaluation services of IFAD, because we all agree here that the governments certainly have to ensure that IFAD is taking national parameters into consideration in the development of their programs, but their programs and their results also have to feed into national policy and strategy.
Actually, I think what I'll do is we've had 4 very good interventions, and we have now Nigeria, UK, and Ecuador who want to speak next. So let me break here and go back to our panel for a moment. So we've heard quite a bit, and I'll leave it up to you in the end to sort of think about which points you want to pick up. But I was particularly sort of interested in the fact that, you know, more focus and maybe changing the way the multilateral institutions function in the new environment. Maybe you can pick this up. Reaffirmation of a multi-actor approach, calling for or thinking about how do we actually assure the expertise of multilateral actors is appropriately brought to bear. And then this whole question of the linking multilateral, national, and local action is actually a really key one. Finally, I think the whole question of leveraging finance that was also mentioned by Germany. Maybe Alvaro, you can pick up on that, but others may have a view on this. So let me turn back to our panel and see who would like to lead the way. Mr. Dr.
Okay.
Mayaki.
I think all of us do agree that we need multilateralism, but at the same time, I think multilateralism is in crisis. If we just take the trade domain, and we see how we are moving from multilateral to bilateral. If we take the whole question of the implementation of a Paris Agreement and the questioning of a green fund, etc., we see that there is a crisis of multilateralism, and I think we should be aware of a crisis so that we can adapt and fight for the necessary solutions. That's my point number one. Point number two, regarding the continent, Africa, most of our solutions are not at national level, but at regional level. Mm-hmm. We're a continent of 55 countries, and this is why, for us, regional integration is very important. So we'll need to build regional markets. It's a form of multilateralism through regional integration, but will lead us to optimal solutions at regional level, whether it is energy, transport, land restoration, etc. So our type of multilateralism will go through a regional integration process. Mm-hmm. And I think the multilateral institutions need to be aware when they deal with Africa with the necessity to support our regional dimension. And very quickly, on the last point regarding globalization and multilateralism, this talks about the G2, the G7, the G20, which are spaces, necessary spaces of interaction, need somehow to find coherent interlinkages with the whole UN system, which is not always the case. And I think in the current reform of the UN system, if these issues need to be taken into account if we want to strengthen multilateralism as we want it.
Thank you. Before I go on to the next, you said something which I'd like to put to the audience in the form of a question, and please pick up your machine again. This is not a pre-cooked question this time. This is a question really coming to my mind because you said multilateralism is in crisis. I'd like to get a sense in the room how many of you would share that view. So, to our organizers in the back, could you please set this device? We don't have this question prepared. Unfortunately, we can't put it up in writing, but I think it's a simple question which we can all respond to. So the question is, do you agree that with the statement, multilateralism is in crisis? If you vote 9, you strongly agree. If you would vote 1, you strongly disagree. And again, 5 is, well, I don't really know, or maybe, maybe not. So, question is, or the statement is, multilateralism is in crisis. 9, you strongly agree. 1, you strongly disagree. 5 is in the middle. Let's start with the voting. It should be on. Okay, it looks like we're slowing down. 5, 3, 2, 1. Stop. All right. How are we doing? Do we think multilateralism is in crisis? Quite a few of you seem to agree, and very few disagree. So still, there may be sort of 30%, a third of you are not so sure that we really need to worry too much right now. So it confirms frankly, my belief, and this is, I mentioned this paper earlier that I wrote. I am worried. So maybe it's I'm not a happy camper that you're all worried, but anyway. All right, with that, let me turn to Ambassador, please.
Sí, gracias, Johannes.
Thank you, Johannes. I'm one of those who's sort of in the middle. Because after almost 35 years of diplomatic service, it's not the first time that I've heard people say that multilateralism is in crisis. I think I've heard people say that since I began my career, because there were many demagogical discussions taking place within the United Nations. Why weren't we moving forward? Why wasn't progress being made? But I also think we need to look at it from another perspective. The perspective, for example, of the specialized agencies of the United Nations. Well, since I began my career, I think that the discussions in the specialized agencies of the UN and the financial institutions are the ones who operate in the fields. And they're the ones, I think, that help us to progress more than New York. And we can't expect miracles of institutions because they don't exist in themselves. They are integrated and made up by its member states. So if they fail and there's a crisis, it's the responsibility of the member states. Thirdly, if you look at a theory of international relations that would deal with the construction of international regimes, we can see over the past years that great progress has been made in multilateral areas, not just globally, but even regionally. Some 50 or 20 years ago, we couldn't imagine, for example, of an international treaty for climate change with rules, with financing that can help to make the fields for cooperation between states clearer. So therefore, I think the 2030 Agenda, as Dr. Ibrahim and David have already pointed out, is a reference for us, a roadmap at the same time that we can follow quite clearly, not only the individual member states, but the UN agencies. And the 2030 Agenda represents a change of paradigm when we look at the way at which it was negotiated and will be implemented nationally, locally, regionally, and throughout the whole of the UN system. I think that's why we need the multilateral system. So the Agenda for 2030 gives the whole multilateral system an opportunity to reinvent itself, to realign itself, and to ensure this necessary coordination. I don't think we should be excessively negative regarding the crisis of multilateralism, which does exist because of the position of many member states who prefer to act bilaterally, or in an even more delicate situation if they act unilaterally. But we do have mechanisms to help to reinvent multilateralism and ensure its success.
Dr. Nabarro, would you like to come in on
I'm just super worried about time, because I actually want to say that I don't think multilateralism is in crisis. I voted 1. And my reason is as follows. The shift has been from the relentless focus on individual institutions now to focusing on specific challenges. And I believe we will move towards a point where the multilateral system puts people and the planet at the center and is much less focused on the beauty and dual nature of its institutions. I think you need multilateral actors to deal with global issues, as our colleague from India said, to deal with international threats like climate change or epidemics of disease, to deal with people and issues left behind, as our colleague from Burkina Faso said, even though this does lead to major dissent when it comes to matters like sexual preference. And we need the multilateral system to help link together global, national, and local. I would like to suggest that we shift away from the term multilateral and talk about movements of multiple stakeholders for change, because in the end, that is the way, as we've already heard from others, that we have to go. And we must recognize that the tougher the problems we try to challenge, the more difficult it will be. And there will be times when individual governments get extremely frustrated and upset, because when you're dealing with global issues of the kind I've identified, there are winners and losers. And if we're not dealing with the tough issues and confronting the fact that there are winners and losers, whether it's about water, whether it's about wealth, whether it's about trade, whether it's about disease, whether it's about animals. If we don't do that, then we're not doing our job. And so it's not in crisis, it's working. And the fact that there are countries walking away from agreements is a natural response to the fact that we're dealing with very difficult issues. It's our job to try to bring them back, in particular, to appeal to their young people who don't want their governments to walk away, because young people are saying, work for our future and don't just work for your own internal interests.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nabarro. I think in terms of a way forward, that certainly would be a way out of a crisis, if there is one. And actually, that's precisely sort of my view. Actually, those of us who believe that multilateral action with multi-stakeholders, multi-actors is needed, we, I think, need to be much more outspoken about this and push much harder. And we need to mobilize the resources. So let me come back for a moment to you, Alvaro. So the resource mobilization, there were some questions also about that. Would you like to comment a bit more on that, especially again, maybe IFAD perspective, but also more generally?
Okay, thank you, Johannes. I'll try to, since I have this opportunity also to address leverage and the vision for finance in that sense. Finance is just a tool. I mean, it's not the end goal. What we are trying to get here is to get to a higher type of volume of resources to address the needs of the countries. That's the goal. For that, we need to become robust and sustainable and efficient IFI. So why? Basically, it's important to start with the why. So the why is to provide funds in a sustainable way to you as member countries in the format and in the lending terms that you need. So that's the first thing, as I said before, that's what we need to listen for. And that will require basically two things. In one sense, it will require a strengthening of the financial and risk framework that we have currently, of the institutional capacity that's needed. So that will be a key focus. And the second thing, which is perhaps more subjective and more difficult to change in any institution, is a change of mindset. The change of mindset starts with IFAD management and IFAD staff, but it's also a change of mindset from the shareholders. It requires, obviously, to have a forward-looking and a long view. It's not only what we're doing currently. Currently, we're working in becoming and making IFAD become a sustainable IFI by putting the policies and the frameworks. But we have to look beyond that, and that beyond is expanding the borrowing capacity, not the borrowing size or the borrowing percentage, the options, to expand and diversify the options. Why? Once more, because core replenishments are not enough. If we heard from you, like President Hombo has reiterated, that we could get 10, 20% every time more to address it, we wouldn't need to expand our borrowing capacities or are diversifying our options. But we need to do it because we're hearing the demand is out there. How to do it? That's going to be done through a consensus with all the member shareholders. We have, as you know, and many of you are aware, a transition framework where we will be looking at where are we lending and where are we borrowing? How do both can be done in a sustainable way? And then there's also another political element, which is the elephant in the room, and many of you are aware, the allocation of funds. We have currently PBAS, but if we want to go to a different stage and to a different level, we also have to have a consensus on that, and that will also come. It's too early to discuss it, but that will be done throughout the next years. And I just want to reiterate that the vision is to make IFAD really have a bigger impact to what we are doing currently, but what we can do through this expansion of the options and the strategies.
Thank you, Alvaro. Let me maybe actually go back to our machine for a minute and ask you a question. I think this can be flashed up. So based on the successful experience with borrowing from sovereign loans, IFAD should improve its financial leverage by prudently accessing private capital markets. Emphasis on prudently. Obviously, you don't want to do it imprudently, but prudently accessing private capital markets. Can we put the question up, please? That was prepared, so let's see. It's the last one on the list that we had. It's coming, okay. Yes, and I'm told we have 20 minutes to before we come to closure, so lunch has been a little bit delayed because of the earlier delays. I don't see it on yet. Now it's on, so is it on? No, not yet. And we activate the machines. There it is. Great. All right. So, who's in favor of, strongly in favor, 9, of prudently accessing private capital markets, and those who strongly believe that's a bad idea? So, let's vote. We're up to 37, 49.
Is your bond?
Okay, a little bit slower this time. Maybe this is not such an exciting question, but it is actually for IFAD. This is really at the core of its future financial planning.
Exciting job.
All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. Let's see where we come out. Alvaro, you.
And once we see.
What?
If I may just, once you finish with I'd like to add one.
Yeah, but brief because I want to reopen. So it's interesting. So we're sort of in the support zone, but we do have quite a few people at least with questions. And we have probably sort of 10% of, so you have some convincing to do. You have a few people who seem quite happy with the direction, but
Not so.
obviously, and this is what we've heard, by the way. This is exactly what we've heard in the replenishment. So that's a good reflection of where I think the issues
If I may add to this, private capital markets can be a great tool. At the same time, I'm also a big believer in innovation. Finance, it's really there's such a variety of instruments. We can talk about many other instruments once the time is there. There are portfolio guarantees, there are insurance instruments. There's many instruments. We can also work with other multilateral development banks. Obviously, this is what we have been discussing up to now, but I'm a big believer in innovation, so there might be more things coming up.
Great. So let's go back to you all out there, and I'm sorry for not giving you perhaps more space. I apologize. I have Nigeria, UK, Ecuador, Vanuatu, and if there are others, please raise your flag or wave so that we can pick up on those also. So next is Nigeria.
Let me again thank you all and join in this very interesting discussion. I think that multilateralism has its own virtues, but I also think that sometimes in operating some of the recommendations of multilateral groups in Africa generally, we tend not to look deep enough at the real problems causing poverty among the rural populace. We are inviting young people to come into agriculture. We're talking about strengthening women. I wonder how many of you know that since 1986, when we had the structural adjustment program across Africa, that interest rates, both for agriculture and industrial growth, have stood at an average of over 25%. 25%. To run a farm or run a factory or build a hospital or a school. The truth is that since then, growth actually stopped in Africa. And what has been growing in Africa is poverty. And that has also given rise to a lot of the crises which you hear of, one of which is Boko Haram in my country. You just can't borrow from commercial banks. They deregulated their interest rates. And so the small farmer working on 1 hectare or even half, with all the support we're getting from IFAD and so on, cannot hire a tractor, get improved seeds, operate his or her farm. And so the output has dropped. So Africa has become hopelessly dependent on foreign countries for food imports.
And Latin America, in a way.
Now, the women we're talking about work themselves to death. Women in Africa labor terribly on the farms. Young people will not go to agriculture because they don't want their destinies to end like their fathers. So they flee to the city. Some of these farmers are asking for no more than $1,000, $1,000 US to operate a farm and make some profit, or at least have enough food for their sustenance in the families. At what point will multilateralism support the farmer to this micro level and increase output? Now, I'm saying this because in Nigeria, in the last 3 years, we got the central bank to come in and support agriculture where the commercial banks became terribly allergic. And we dropped rice importation from 650,000 tons to 20,000 tons in just 2.5 years, because farmers got access to credit at 9%, which is even bad enough. So I think that we need to look at the peculiarities of individual countries and ask how we can get closer to those most vulnerable segments of society who want to participate but are simply blocked because they have no access to credit, even at the smallest level, and have no access to equipment, mechanization, value addition, processing, and so on. If not, we can say the same thing over and over again. Poverty will remain, and the crisis engendered by extreme poverty and the hopelessness among the youths in Africa, who now believe that crossing the Sahara Desert to Libya and heading for Europe is a solution to their problem. Very good. And I think we need to look at this seriously and design systems that give credit. And to the women, I may say this. They have a record in the world of being the best people who repay loans. Almost 98%. When they borrow, they pay. The men do a lot worse, although the men say that it's the fault of the women, and that's why they're not repaying. But the women...
Maybe we can come to closure. Thank you.
Exactly. So I think we need to look at this.
As a man, I guess.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. No, your point is very well taken, and coming from the World Bank, as I did a long time ago, I look at IFAD, and I think in some ways IFAD is actually doing exactly what you say. It's trying to do what you say we should be doing. I'm happy to say the World Bank has also changed since the adjustment loan challenges back then. But anyway, I think your point is very well taken, and maybe I can suggest to you that you actually raise this in your
Ibrahim, take off your mic.
Discussions with the management specifically. Let me now turn to UK, followed by Ecuador, Vanuatu, and Algeria. So UK, please.
Thank you. Is the mic? Yeah. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to say, or just to respond to the question about is multilateralism in crisis. The world absolutely needs the multilateral system. But the multilateral system needs reform. The United Nations Secretary General recognizes that, and he's proposed reforms to that system, and the UK is a strong supporter of those reforms. The UK is also a strong supporter of the African Union NEPAD Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Programme. One of the key tools that CAADP used was the concept of peer review, the concept where each member state used the multilateral system to review each other's progress and encourage each other to make more progress. I would like to see more peer review in the multilateral system. I'd like to see multilateral bodies like this one coming together to compare progress between member states. And I'd welcome the panel's views on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are pressed for time. We have about 10 minutes left before I need to close us down, but I have 3 more speakers, and then depending on how we are with time, I'll either turn back or give a couple more room here. But let's continue with Ecuador, please.
Thank you. Just very quickly. Yesterday and today, we've talked about fragility and of course, the involvement of the word crisis and how that has some negative connotations, but I think that it's a great opportunity for us to understand that there's a constant process of transformation when it comes to multilateralism and its institutions. There is, of course, a need for change, but there is great complexity as we consider both yesterday and today. And there are challenges and opportunities in the agricultural sector. Now, we were talking about the roadmap and the Agenda 2030, and this brings to mind a very significant challenge which needs to be evoked here. The imbalance that exists when it comes to the concentration of income. For 35 years, we've studied poverty, but I think that we need to devote our energy right now to studying wealth, the mechanisms that generate it, and the involvement of IFAD in the market also leads us to understand what kind of funding mechanisms and instruments are at play. But anyway, it is these mechanisms that have also, unfortunately, consolidated the imbalance that exists throughout the world today. So I think that it's of paramount importance that among the opportunities and challenges of multilateralism, we also consider the fact that not everyone will be able to benefit from the consolidated wealth that's been generated. And these people will be affected by challenges as well. So I think that the two great issues of multilateralism here, I mean, if you talk about subsidies, well, industrialized countries have not manifested their political will to eliminate subsidies because that's part of the strategy of food security for their people. And then tapping into knowledge and knowledge mining. These are important mechanisms that have led to the concentration of wealth, I'm afraid. Consequently, if multilateralism takes on this change, this different perspective, then different answers will be found, and they're probably going to be more sustainable when it comes to involvement and participation and world peace. Thank you.
For this comment, and I think it reminds me of, I think it was Dr. Nabarro said winners and losers. I mean, I think we really, and this is what I think we learned from the criticisms and the political backlash to globalization, that we actually have to look more carefully at what's happening to the losers of these transformations and how do we cushion the losses and bring them back into the ship so they don't end up challenging from the outside. So thank you very much. I now have actually the last comment because Algeria decided to drop its flag. I have last comment from Vanuatu, and then I'm afraid I'll have to close the contributions from the floor, and we'll briefly turn back to our panel. So Vanuatu, please.
Thank you, moderator. Let me just thank the panelists. The issue that we are discussing is a very important one, and indeed it is important to look at the proper coordination among agencies. That's an issue where a lot of overlaps that exist since, and we really need to look at that. The other issue is on the food waste. I think one of the discussions is not pertaining on this matter, and yesterday when the president made his opening remarks, he indicated that 815 million people go hungry, and 200 million children stand of extremely overweight. Now, the issue is that how can we wisely address the issue of food waste and fight hunger, malnutrition, and poverty? And finally, with respect to nutrition, I think FAO has adopted its Global Action Program for Nutrition on Small and Developing States, and I'm looking forward to see that FAO and IFAD can collaborate to timely implement this gap. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I say, I apologize for closing down the discussion now, and I would like to turn to our remaining three panelists and ask them, so what is, in just a minute, what is your key takeaway? And maybe start from the opposite direction. Alvaro, what do you take away as sort of a key implication for IFAD now as you look at your job, but maybe a bit more broadly also?
Thank you, Johannes. Well, from the floor, I'm hearing there's a growing demand and a growing need, and it has been expressed very clearly. So from my side on the finance and management team, we will be working on trying to expand how to get to this different stage of IFAD and trying to get to the volume and the resources that are needed.
Thank you very much. Dr. Nabarro.
Thank you very much indeed. I hear a lot of focus on poverty and also inequity, still very much burning in your minds and hearts, and we have to keep that at the center of our mission. Secondly, I'm hearing a real focus on intersectoral working and systems approaches, and I was saying that as well myself, so that was something I felt delighted about. Thirdly, an emphasis on the way in which the UN family is working, suggestions of better coordination and peer review. And lastly, a real excitement, I feel, in the room about the kind of agenda that IFAD pursues, both with regard to new imaginative ways of raising money, but also the ambitions that the President has for focusing on a broad approach, including food waste and loss, efficiency, nutrition, and climate. So I'm inspired, and I wish you well, and I hope that you will continue as governors of IFAD also to support the whole of the multilateral system as it undergoes the reforms that Antonio Guterres is trying to implement, because in the end, it is the member states who will decide whether they want those reforms, and that is the same people as all of you in this room working in other governing bodies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nabarro. And then last but definitely not least, Madam Ambassador, you have almost the last word.
Thank you, Johannes. I think that I take with me that Agenda 2030 gives us a roadmap to go. I would like to see in this debate on multilateralism to throw a very provocative idea. It's we have and we need another international development cooperation mindset. Stop thinking about donors and recipients. We have everything to learn from each other. I was in an IFAD visit to Bangladesh, and what they did with microcredits to agricultural and rural area is something we all need to learn. And they did it with IFAD's first support. So I was thinking, listening to Nigeria, who can help you with this? IFAD and Bangladesh. You don't need the traditional donors. So, and we need to stop talking only about North-South cooperation, South-South cooperation. No, it's a whole new concept of international development cooperation in which we don't need to leave anyone behind, but in which every one of us can contribute, each country, and not only each country, but each civil society, private sector, scientists, this with a whole new concept. I think that is the main challenge that we have ahead of us, and that I would like to see IFAD starting to work with that mentality in the near future. And I really hope that we can address this idea also in New York in the UN reform debates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. We are out of time, and so let me quickly just also share my 3 takeaways with you from this. First of all, I do feel a lot of energy in the room in support of multilateralism and indeed multilateral action and institutions, but, and there's always a but we need to adapt, we need to reform as appropriate, and we need, I think, a very clear focus on the guiding stars of the SDGs defined broadly for certainly in the food sector and not too narrowly. Secondly, I think you all support much more, well, I would say a new mindset, if I wish, if I may pick up on the ambassador's point, a new mindset that is not donor, recipient, but actually working together, learning from each other, listening to each other, much more carefully than perhaps collectively we have done. Multi-sector, multi-actor, and better linkages between what we sort of do at the high level of the capitals and even the head offices in the multilateral agencies, really listen to what and engage with the local actors and see what the local actors need, the local population. And again, I come back to the Nigerian intervention. I think from my experience with lots of other multilateral organizations, I'm happy to say that what I've seen is that IFAD does that particularly well. Relatively speaking, I'm sure it could still do better. Finally, on the resource side, I think, you know, it is leverage, and clearly the institutions have to leverage the equity that's in them, and you have collectively put a huge amount of equity in these multilateral institutions, not all of which actually, as a taxpayer, I feel sometimes, is efficiently used. So leverage has to be explored, has to be used very prudently and effectively, but in the end, it comes back to you, as we've heard so many times now. It is you, the member states. If you don't support these institutions, and I look mostly now at my own government, the US government of the USA, if we don't support these institutions, they're going to fall away over time, gradually. It's a bit like the infamous frog sitting in the hot water pot. Will suddenly wake up, or our grandchildren wake up. We don't have the institutions needed to deal with the global problems. So I personally feel all of us who are more or less convinced that the multilateral approaches are an essential complement to national and local action, that we speak up and we work together across institutions, across governments, to send that message very clearly to our constituencies and explain very clearly why we think is the case. I think we've not done enough, I myself included, on that particular side. So thank you very much to our panelists. Let's give them a big hand. And in terms of, thank you.